Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. I'm Yang Zhang, Director, Queens Public Library at Flushing. Welcome to Flushing Library. Councilmember An, President Walker, so many old friends from the Flushing Library groups and community leaders. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for joining our program today. Today, we're here to celebrate a remarkable person in the history of the library and the history of Flushing, Mary Shaw. Just a quick question. How many of you in this room know where to find Mary Shaw's picture in the library? Wow, we got quite a few experts here. And the painter of the Mary Shaw painting, the artist, Eddie Abram, is also here. It's great to see you here, Eddie. This also reminds me our Mary Shaw painting unveiling event here, right here in this auditorium, back in what year? Do we still remember the year? 2018, yes, great memory. 2018, we have the picture painting unveiling event right here in the auditorium. It was a wonderful event. Mary Shaw was a Flushing resident in the mid to late 1800s. She was an educator, an activist. She was a strong advocate for free membership of the library. In 1905, she bequeathed $1,000 to Flushing Library. Our program today is about her life and the legacy she left behind. Every year in Flushing Library, we host a special event dedicated to Mary Shaw. The last time we had the special event here dedicated to Mary Shaw was in February. I'm so glad we can continue the tradition here with all of you today. Thank you so much for coming from across Queens, from outside of Queens to Flushing. And thank you so much for being part of this wonderful celebration event. Now it's my honor to introduce our Councilmember Sandra Ang. Councilmember Ang is a strong supporter of the library. She advocates for us in the City Hall. She often comes to the library to support our program. This is her second time in a row coming to the library to support our Mary Shaw program in 2 months, besides many other programs in the library. Thank you so much for your support, Councilmember Ang. Now, please join me in welcoming Councilmember Sandra Ang.
Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to join all of you here today as we celebrate the 130th anniversary of Queens Public Library, and we reflect on the remarkable history that has shaped this institution into what it is today. Mary Shaw is an educator, an activist, a philanthropist, whose impact continually resonates more than a century later. At a time when opportunities are not equally available to all, she stood firmly for the idea that a library should be available and accessible to everyone. What makes the story even more powerful is that the community she was a part of. In the mid to late 19th century, Flushing was home to one of the earliest free Black settlements in what would become New York City. It is amazing to think that Flushing Library, which is so essential to the daily life of today's Asian American community, has deep roots connected to one of the earliest free Black settlements in our city's history. Reminds us that the story of Flushing, the story of this library, is one of diversity, perseverance, and shared progress. The faces and language spoken inside these walls might change, but the mission remains the same: access, opportunity, and community. And that's why the work with Queens Public Library is so important, not just here in Flushing, but the neighborhoods across our borough. I want to thank the CEO, thank Ms. Walcott, Yang, and all the staff here at Queens Public Library for this continuing rich legacy. And lastly, I'm going to thank Eddie Abrams right here, I remember sitting with Eddie Abrams at the Flushing Democratic Club in the basement, and he was advocating for that time for the Mary Shaw painting right here, and he was the one who introduced me to this amazing woman, Mary Shaw. So thank you, Eddie. Have a great celebration today.
Now, I would like to introduce someone who is very special behind our program today, Susan Latham. Susan is the person who came up with this wonderful program idea. She's the brain behind all of it. Thank you, Susan, for the great program idea, and thank you for the opportunity to bring all of us together today. Now, please help me in welcoming Susan Latham.
Hi, everyone. Great to see you. I want to welcome everyone who is here both in person as well as our virtual audience today. We're really glad you could join us to A Legacy of Learning, the Life and Impact of Mary Shaw. I, for one, am very excited to learn more about Mary Shaw in today's lecture by Dr. Hope McCaffrey. So as Yang mentioned, we do have this lovely portrait of Mary Shaw hanging in the lobby, and that is part of how Queens Public Library has honored her contribution to what is now Flushing Library. She's also the namesake of the Queens Public Library Foundation's Legacy Giving Society, the Mary Shaw Society, and I want to acknowledge our Mary Shaw Society members who are here today. Thank you for being here. If anyone is interested in more information about that society, please look for me or my colleague, Matthew Brookshire, after today's presentation. I also want to acknowledge our donors who are here today because it's your support that makes programs like these possible. So thank you for your generosity. And finally, there is one person, I know Yang said I'm the brains behind this program. Really, the brains are Dr. McCaffrey, who I'm going to introduce in a moment. But there is one person. Yes, Jacqueline Colson reached out to the library, it's got to be a year or a year and a half ago, because she wanted to know about getting an update and a correction into the Mary Shaw brochure that we've had for several years. And it was her perseverance and her reaching out that led to our research, and it led us to identify Dr. McCaffrey as a historian who had this wonderful information, all of which is available in this brochure. So if you haven't picked it up, please do. But really, thank you, Jacqueline, because you were the really the inspiration that led to today's event. So thank you so much. And I think some applause for Jacqueline. So after today's lecture, our president and CEO, Dennis Walcott, will join Dr. McCaffrey on the stage to discuss Mary Shaw's legacy to the library and the people of Flushing, and what we can learn from her contributions to her community. There will also be an opportunity for people to ask questions, and we have some microphones. We'll have some staff who are available to pass them to you. And now I am happy to introduce Dr. Hope McCaffrey. Dr. McCaffrey is the Assistant Program Director of the George and Ann Richards Civil War Era Center at Penn State, where she is also Assistant Research Professor in the Department of History. Dr. McCaffrey was previously a pre-doctoral fellow at the Richards Center in 2024 to 2025 and earned her PhD in history from Northwestern University in 2025. She's a historian of gender and politics in the 19th century United States, and her current book project focuses on white women's partisan activism in the Democratic Party during the antebellum and Civil War eras. Her research has been supported by the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, the New York Public Library, and the American Association of American Women. Please help me welcome Dr. McCaffrey.
Thank you all. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Susan, for that lovely introduction. And I just want to really thank Susan Latham for reaching out to me and inviting me to come speak today. Also to Matthew Berkshire and President Dennis Walcott for joining today. Thank you all for being here and for inviting me and welcoming me into your community today. As Susan mentioned, today I'm talking about Mary E. Shaw, a legacy of learning the life and impact of Mary E. Shaw. I'm going to switch to this microphone. Can you still hear me? Yes, okay. No? Is this better? Yes? Okay, sorry. All right, so I'd like to begin with an image. I think it's very fitting that I begin with this image here because this image is really what started me kind of down the path of research on Mary Shaw. And it's also, I think, particularly fitting because it's probably the image that is most familiar to all of you who have frequented Flushing Library before. Though this photo was actually labeled as unidentified in some collections, we know, and we hope to share more broadly this knowledge with others, that this woman is Mary E. Shaw, who, as it turns out, was not so unknown in her own time and in her own community. In fact, this very image greeted patrons when they walked into a Flushing branch of the Queens Public Library for decades. Mary Shaw was a force in Flushing. And actually, as I hope to show today, really across the entire Eastern Seaboard. This image, as it turns out, is really just a small key that opens a big door to a world of history. Before I dive in, I just want to offer a note on this image as a historical source, because I think it matters that Mary Shaw appears to us visually in the archive, that her likeness is preserved in this portrait, which she sat for most likely in the 1880s. Visual sources like this one do such important work in helping us to understand Black women's history in this period, kind of in the second half of the 19th century. As historian Hilary N. Green has written, such images actually give voice to the, quote, many unidentified individuals who left little to no written records, but celebrated their new status and existence through photographic technology. Mary Shaw was one such individual who used this new photographic technology to document and celebrate her existence and her achievements. Though she herself left scarce written records, at least that we know about, always hoping that more will appear in the archives, this photo offers a starting place from which we can begin to understand the life and, importantly, the legacy of this activist, philanthropist, and educator. So my goal for today is to talk about the life and legacy of Mary Shaw, but also about the world in which she lived, and especially the world that she really hoped to create. We will examine Mary Shaw's experience kind of at a granular, at the more local level, but I also hope to offer an understanding of how her reach was really vast, and that the people and institutions she connected herself to were national and also intergenerational in impact. Hers is really the story of how one person invested in community can shape many, many lives. So Mary Ann Elizabeth Hood, who appears in the historical records as Mary E., Mary Elizabeth, Mary Ann, sometimes even Mary Ann E., sort of all these iterations of her name. She was born March 13th, 1851 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. This image is from North Street, Lancaster, taken shortly after the period in which Mary Shaw would have lived there. She was the daughter of Lewis Hood and Sarah Hood and was educated in New York. Though much of her early life remains a bit elusive, such as where exactly she lived in Lancaster, where exactly she attended school, her childhood was undoubtedly marked by civil war, which, as we know, roiled the Union, beginning when Mary Hood was just 9 years old. And it lasted until her kind of early teen years. Importantly, also, she came of age during the throes of Reconstruction. So Reconstruction, typically acknowledged as the years between 1865 and 1877, was initially a time of great hope and promise for African Americans and also their white allies who sought to realize freedom really in the fullest meaning of the term. So not just the absence of slavery, but full citizenship, belonging, and inclusion in US society and democracy. When the federal government abandoned its support for such a project, African Americans invested in and really utilized the institutions, schools, and organizations they had established to manifest for themselves the world that they wanted to live in. So Mary Hood committed early to the cause of education as her life's work. And she was not alone in this endeavor. Many African Americans believed that education was the best means for advancement in the aftermath of emancipation. The many schools for young African American men and women, which really dotted and really filled the entire Atlantic seaboard, were founded and supported by African American communities and their white allies. And these schools were really one of the great achievements of the Reconstruction era. And this was due in no small part to the tireless work of women like Mary Hood Shaw. So by the time she was 20, Hood was already working as a teacher and living in New York City. She was employed by the city itself, and at the recently opened school number 3 for African American children, she was working in the primary department. And this school was located at 225 West 41st Street, so near 8th Avenue in Manhattan. Hood worked alongside this gentleman, Charles L. Reason, who was a well-known African-American educator who also taught in the grammar department and was principal at that same school that Mary was teaching at. Reason also held the distinction of the first African-American to hold a professorship at a predominantly white college, that was at New York Central College. So Mary Hood was working at this school number 3, with Reason, the year that he led the successful campaign to end school segregation in New York State, and that was in 1873 with the Civil Rights Act that the state legislature passed. I apologize for the grainy image, but I'll try to explain what this is. So as a working woman, Hood saved up enough money to open a bank account, which she did at the New York City branch of the Freedmen's Savings Bank. The bank, however, closed the following year in 1874 due to really widespread corruption and mismanagement among its white board members. But what's really incredible about this document is the very simple act of just opening a bank account really gives us a rich treasure trove of information about Mary Shaw, including the year it opened, where she lived, where she worked, where she was born, who she worked for. Sorry that it's so grainy. And also at the bottom is her signature, which is a pretty incredible thing to see. So during these years in the early 1870s, Mary Hood enmeshed herself in a community of hardworking and prominent African-American New Yorkers. If any of you have seen the Gilded Age HBO series, kind of think the Peggy Scott family, that's really kind of the world in which Mary Shaw was living and working. She lived with the wealthy Ten Eyck family while teaching in the public schools, and they all lived at 200 Green Street in Manhattan. The Ten Eycks, too, were friends and also supporters of Charles Reason. So it was also during this time that Mary met her future husband. Mary Hood married John William A. Shaw 2 days before Christmas in 1873, right here at St. Philip's Church. This is the Mulberry Street location. St. Philip's was the first African-American Episcopal parish in the city of New York, and this is an image of the church at 305 Mulberry Street, where the Shaws were married. The church would actually move again in 1886 to West 25th Street, and the church is actually now located on West 134th Street in Harlem. The cornerstone was laid there in 1910. After marrying here, the couple moved almost immediately to Washington, D.C., where John Shaw attended Howard University and worked as a news dealer. In September of 1874, they welcomed a daughter who they named Ethel. In fact, the birth certificate notes that Ethel was born on College Street in Washington, which was basically on Howard University's campus, which I think was a particularly sort of auspicious sign for the central place that education would hold in the Shaw family's lives. So who was John Shaw? I want to just take a quick minute and talk about him because he really cuts an interesting and rather complex historical profile. John Shaw was actually born in Antigua in 1849, which was a British colony infamous for its sugar plantations and its deadly labor conditions. John Shaw likely descended from formerly enslaved people, as the British emancipated the people they enslaved there just 15 years prior to John Shaw's birth. He immigrated to the United States in 1856 when he was just 7 years old. 16 years later, when he came of age, he applied to be a naturalized US citizen. That was in 1872, while he was working at a clerk and actually living at 303 Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan, which was right next door to the church in which he would marry, and also was just a few blocks away from where Mary Hood was living that very year. So after attending Howard University's theological department and spending a year in its medical college, John Shaw graduated with an undergraduate degree. That was in 1874. He and Mary taught school for a short stint in the South, including in South Carolina, before they moved back to New York. John Shaw soon gained a reputation as one of the more, quote, fiery editors of the African-American press in the city. He published and edited really a number of newspapers throughout the course of his life, but gained prominence first as the editor of a paper he named The Suffragist. Mary Shaw's husband would wear many hats in his lifetime and breaking racial barriers along the way. In 1883, for instance, he was employed as a salesman in one of the more prestigious clothing houses in New York City, the Liverpool and London Clothing Company. But John Shaw became best known actually as a politician. He was, somewhat surprisingly for this period, in the late 1870s to early 1880s, a devoted Democratic partisan. Prior to and even after the Civil War, the Democratic Party really stood as a monolith against abolition and against Black rights in both the Southern and the Northern contexts. Yet by the end of the 19th century, this association was shifting due in part to the outcome of the very famous or infamous 1876 election, which is the very presidential election for when the National Republican Party really abandoned its commitments to building a multiracial democracy. So John Shaw really was at the fore of these shifting partisan grounds. He helped organize and then became chairman of the New York Colored Democratic Association, the African-American paper, the New York Globe, which did not entirely agree with his politics, termed John Shaw, quote, a man of force and brain who hauls the Republican Party over the coals and very justly. They commended him for coming before the people as an avowed Democrat, but they said in 1884 they could not, quote, agree with him or follow where he would lead, end quote. So John Shaw really propelled himself into elite Democratic circles. He even traveled in 1885 to Washington, D.C. to meet with the newly inaugurated President Grover Cleveland. Cleveland was the first Democrat to be elected to that office since before the Civil War. John Shaw argued that the claims and needs of African Americans received what he termed scant consideration from both political parties, and that in the North and in the South, what he called a revulsion of sentiment existed against African Americans, rendering them politically powerless in both regions. Nevertheless, he wrote, African Americans must fight on. John Shaw recognized and was not afraid to point out the hollowness of Northern and especially Republican rhetoric concerning racial equality. In some ways, John Shaw's criticism foreshadowed the sentiments that activists like Malcolm X, James Baldwin, and Stokely Carmichael would also later make. For John Shaw, the future lay in the young African-American people of his generation, whom he deemed the, quote, sophisticated product of the schools with awakened consciousness and social and political recognition. John Shaw was rewarded for his partisanship with an inspector position in the Department of Public Works in New York City, the first African American to hold such a position. Later, he became the Deputy Commissioner of Taxes for Queens County. And he also became famous, or maybe we should say infamous, for being one of the first African American men to be a Tammany office holder. He also, later in his life, lived in London for nearly 8 years, where he agitated on behalf of labor politics. And here is Tammany Hall. It would seem that Mary Shaw, online. Oh, sorry. It would seem that Mary Shaw did not accompany him on many of these sojourns. What is clear is that Mary Shaw, like her husband, believed in the promise of racial uplift and awakened consciousness. However, maybe unlike her husband, who leaned heavily on partisan politics to advance this vision, Mary Shaw pursued this goal through her lifelong commitment to teaching and education. In 1875, after John had graduated from Howard, the young Shaw family was in South Carolina, where Mary Shaw actually taught at the Avery Institute in Charleston. Her teaching resume also included schools in Delaware, Georgia, Indiana, and then finally Queens. So by 1880, 5 years after Mary Shaw had been working in South Carolina, the small Shaw family had settled in Flushing, which was at that time an independent city. In Flushing, the Shaws became part of and also very prominent in a vibrant African American community, a community which we've also heard that was one of really the earliest free black settlements in what would eventually become Greater New York. African Americans settled in Flushing due to the area's reputation for tolerance, both religious and otherwise. The white Quakers who had settled there were some of the earliest white agitators for the abolition of slavery. Free African Americans wasted no time building lives and institutions here in Flushing. The Macedonia AME Church, pictured here, was constructed in 1811, AME standing for African Methodist Episcopal Church. A sign, the church being built, was a sign that there was already a vibrant community in Flushing by the early 19th century. And this is a picture of the original structure, I should say, which no longer stands. Frederick Douglass even gave a speech at the newly built Flushing Town Hall in 1865. And with the railroads arriving around the same time, the Shaws really moved to Flushing as the town was flourishing into a city. And the Shaw family thrived here in Flushing, where Mary worked as a teacher and John edited his newspaper, The Suffragist, and really built his political domain. The school that Mary Shaw taught at had started in 1814 as a racially integrated charity school run by the Quaker Flushing Female Association. But by the time Mary arrived there, the school had evolved into a separate public school for African American children. Picture of the school here. And by 1887, Mary, after having worked there, was promoted to head teacher for this school for African American students in Flushing. When the school changed locations from its Lincoln building to the white primary school on Union Street, so they brought the students together into the same building, the African American children were kept apart. They were kept separate from the white children in the building, and they were given separate rooms and even a separate yard to play in. This image here is from the collection of the New York Historical, and it's labeled as the Colored School in Flushing in their collection. And this is when the school was located on Lincoln Avenue between Main and Union. So this photograph was taken in 1922. However, this is the building that Mary would have started teaching in Flushing. The Shaws, and especially Mary, invested their time and resources in the growing city and its influential Black community. Mary Shaw helped to establish Flushing Free Library, which changed from a subscription-based association to a free circulating library in 1884. In other words, you didn't have to pay to go and take out books anymore. It was free starting in 1884. Various residents used the library as a space for gathering, meetings, and even lectures. maybe not unlike this one, including the Lyceum Association, which consisted of young African American people. In 1891, the Flushing Library purchased a small Baptist church on the corner of Main and Kissimmee Boulevard, which would be the first of 4 library buildings to stand on that site. And this is an image here of that first building. You can kind of see the intersection of the roads, and that's actually the site where this is the 4th building to be on this site. So by 1888, Mary Shaw had been promoted to principal, but she continued to work tirelessly in her many roles as an educator in Flushing. In addition to her duties as principal of the grammar school, she also taught adults in the evening. The Flushing Female Association had opened a night school for African Americans 2 nights a week, and Mary Shaw was the instructor there. At one of the school graduations she oversaw, a member of the Board of Education recognized her achievements, stating that he, quote, hoped she would remain as teacher in Flushing as long as she lived. It was also around this time that Mary Shaw likely had her likeness preserved. And I'd like to turn one more time to the image of Mary Shaw and take a minute to really sort of examine it a little bit more closely. So if you notice at the bottom of the copy image here, if you can see way down there, we can see what seems to say Bostwick 98 6th Ave, New York, which is the place where Shaw went to have her picture taken. So the studio put its address on the bottom of the photo there. That studio was run by New York-born James Alba Bostwick, and it was located here at this location on 6th between 8th and 9th Streets in Manhattan during the years between 1875 and 1887, meaning Mary Shaw was likely living in Flushing and traveled quite the distance from her home to go have her picture taken sometime in the early 1880s. Her gaze, intently looking past the camera, seems to be turned ahead to the future. Her comportment is very confident, her Gilded Age dress is accented with trimmings, and a flowering ornamental pin is affixed to her collar. She also wears a ring, if you can see it, on her right hand. Historian Hilary Green reminds us that, like many African Americans, this portrait really illuminates that Mary Shaw found empowerment in not only this burgeoning form of technology, but in her own status and her accomplishments. And Mary Shaw was not alone in doing this. In fact, she was not even the only one traveling to the Bostwick studio for her photo. Other extant photographs of African American women, some of whom remain still unidentified, at least for now, bear the same imprint. So this image on your left, for instance, is labeled Unidentified Woman, and it's in the holdings of the University of North Florida Library. It appears tucked among the collection of Eartha M.M. White, who was another prominent African-American philanthropist and businesswoman. Though White lived and dedicated most of her life to the Jacksonville community, she spent a period of time in New York City in the 1890s. This other image is of Julia A.J. Foote, who was ordained as the first woman deacon in the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. One wonders if these women may have crossed paths with another prominent educator who patronized the same studio. Even as extant records allow us only a glimpse of the work that Shaw undertook and the people that she labored alongside, the record makes clear that Mary Shaw cultivated an extensive network. While we don't currently know for certain if she met people like Julia Foote, we can glean a sense of how dedicated she was to her role as an educator in Flushing. As principal of Flushing's Grammar School for African American children, she championed a wide-ranging and ambitious plan for her students' education. She worked with 2 assistant teachers. In 1890, she orchestrated a tree planting for Arbor Day, including one in honor of Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution. Her school was small, but the education her students received was rigorous. Shaw held graduation ceremonies here at Flushing's Town Hall, which was also referred to as Flushing Opera House, and was the same venue at which Frederick Douglass had given a speech maybe 20 years, 30 years earlier. In front of a crowd of reportedly 500 people, the 4 graduating students that year in 1890 successfully performed a program that included calisthenics, complete with dumbbell exercises, music performances, both singing and piano. Shaw even oversaw the performance of 2 cantatas. There were recitations, and students read original essays. The valedictorian also gave a speech. After the superintendent offered the diplomas to the 4 graduates, Shaw's good friend, Catherine Tenike, presented an American flag to the school. 2 years later, the number of graduates had gone from 4 to 12 students in Mary Shaw's school. The impact of Mary Shaw's commitment to community and education was also felt in her work producing the next generation of African American teachers. The first 3 African American students to enroll at Flushing High School were all taught by Mary Shaw, and they all went on to become teachers. Emelina Smith at the same school in Flushing with Mary Shaw, Emma Fox taught in Flushing and Brooklyn, and Ada Townsend taught African American children in Amityville. Mary Shaw was thus she was not just living in Flushing, but already building a real legacy there. And I wanted to just give a sense of where the Shaws lived and moved throughout their tenure in Flushing, as they lived in several different homes. So in 1885, the family was living on State near Levitt Street. So I have 2 maps here. The one on the left is zoomed out of Flushing, and the one on the right is kind of the red square. And the red dot is where the school that Mary taught at, the approximate location of the school. So you can see she was living on this corner of State and Levitt, just north of the school. Later, Mary Shaw moved south, so she was living in 1890 and 1891 at what was then 55 Grove Street on the corner of kind of Grove and Main. John Shaw, if you'll notice, was not listed in these directories. Likely these were some of the years that he was living abroad and undertaking his political work abroad. But as you can see, Mary Shaw moved to just south of where she was working and was right on the corner of Grove and Main Street. As Shaw spent her days and nights dedicated to teaching Flushing's African American community, she also instilled this pursuit of education in her daughter, Ethel. Shaw prioritized a top-tier education for Ethel, who, if you recall, was born in September of 1874 while the family was living in Washington, D.C. Ethel attended the West Newton English and Classical School, sometimes referred to as the Allen School, which was a model school in Massachusetts that, rather uniquely for this time, educated a racially integrated and also a co-ed student population. At the school's closing exercises, Ethel performed a piano solo. After graduating in 1891, she also gained employment as a teacher at the prestigious Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which was then under the leadership of Booker T. Washington. And this is an image of a history class at Tuskegee from around the time that Ethel would have been teaching there. And this was no small thing for Ethel Shaw. It was a big deal to be appointed in this position. Newspapers in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois printed the news and celebrated her appointment on the board of instructors, some papers even describing Ethel as, quote, universally loved by teachers and fellow students. Ethel worked at the school for several years, making nearly $60 annually, which included room and board. Ethel's employment at Booker T. Washington's Institute was just one of the ways that the family was deeply connected to Tuskegee and its mission. Both Mary and John Shaw were proponents of the kind of education that provided skills for economic, social, and moral development and uplift that constituted Tuskegee's ethos under Washington's leadership. John even composed a piece of literature which he termed a vindication of Booker T. Washington and his work. The school, self-labeled as not only a school, but an African-American village and community as well. So the Shaw family experienced a devastating loss when Ethel passed away while teaching here at Tuskegee just after New Year's Day in 1893. The Indianapolis Freeman, the first illustrated Black newspaper in the US, printed her death announcement, sharing the news with the paper's tens of thousands of subscribers. While we don't have records of how Mary Shaw reacted to such devastating news, her actions in the years before her own death indicate that she was profoundly saddened and felt deeply the loss of her only daughter, of whom she was extremely proud. 1893 proved to be a trying year for Mary Shaw. Later that very same year, she lost her friend, Catherine Teneyck, the same friend with whom Mary had lived when she first arrived in New York, and who had gifted her school that American flag just a few years prior at their graduation. The friends were also connected through their work with St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church. Some histories even refer to Mary Shaw as the Teneycks' adopted daughter. What this makes abundantly clear is that by the time she passed, the 82-year-old Catherine Teneyck cared deeply for Mary Shaw, held her in high esteem, and appreciated her friendship and her vision for the world. And Catherine Teneyck demonstrated this kinship ties she had made with Shaw in her will. Catherine had married Joseph Teneyck, who was reported to be one of the wealthiest African-American men in New York City. Working as first a servant, then a restaurateur and caterer, Teneyck amassed nearly $100,000. When he passed in 1887, Joseph Teneyck left $5,000 to Mary Shaw. When Catherine passed 6 years later, she stipulated in her will, that apart from her own self, no one else was allowed to be interred in her cemetery plot except for her friend, Mary Shaw. And second, apart from a few small sums given to cousins and her servants, the entirety of her estate was left in trust for Mary Shaw. And she specified that Mary was to dispense of the estate to any such person or persons she wished. Despite, or perhaps in spite of, the life-changing inheritance Catherine secured for Mary in her will, Catherine Teneyck made sure to state in her will that she was still indebted to Mary Shaw. And here's an excerpt from Catherine Teneyck's will. It says, "While it is not necessary for me to do so, I still desire to say that in making the above provisions in favor of my friend Mary E. Shaw, I am still her debtor for the attention, kindness, and services she has rendered me, and which are not fully remunerated by the provisions herein on her behalf." From Catherine Teneyck, Mary Shaw inherited an estate worth between $75,000 and $100,000. In the following year, Mary Shaw tendered her resignation to the Flushing Board of Education. As she did so, the president of the board gave her a letter commending her high esteem as a teacher. But this did not mean that Mary Shaw was stepping away from her investments in education and community. In the late 1890s, she served on committees for the Packer Institute in Brooklyn. She was on the executive committee of the New York Kindergarten and Sewing School for Colored Children, and she was treasurer of St. Philip's Parish Home. And I just want to note here that these are only the things that we know about or that I've come across or others have come across via examining records and newspapers and books. We can really only begin to imagine all of the work that she was doing behind the scenes and the work that went undocumented. Mary Shaw showed no signs of slowing down as the new century dawned. In the first years of the 20th century, Mary Shaw traveled to Europe with Annie Johnson, an African-American woman who had worked also for Catherine Teneyck, and now in these years likely acted as both a lady's maid and a companion for Mary Shaw. The pair sailed home on the SS Belgenland, an iron-hulled sail steamer, pictured here, and they returned back to the United States in October of 1902. So separated from her husband, who was still abroad, Mary Shaw moved back to her home state, taking with her the precious things she had collected throughout her years in Flushing: her silverware, her photographs, and importantly, her books. She passed away in March 1905 at the young age of 53 in Philadelphia. Her funeral took place at the St. Philip's Church, where she had been married, but which was now located on that 25th Street location in Manhattan. She was laid to rest in Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn, sharing the plot laid aside for her by Catherine Teneyck. Though her life had ended, her impact on the Flushing community and really African American institutions of learning was just beginning. Through her very detailed and, luckily for us, preserved and now digitized final will, we can understand Mary Shaw's worldview more fully. In 1903, Mary drew up a thoughtful, practical, and comprehensive will in which she delineated where and how she wanted her estate distributed. Mary Shaw constructed her own legacy. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on estates and probates, but what I think Mary Shaw's will does show is that she was very intentional, she was thorough, she was specific, and she demonstrated financial and legal literacy and sophistication, and she dispensed with her estate to the people she saw fit, just as her friend Catherine had hoped. The most striking detail to emerge from Mary Shaw's will was her sizable bequest to the Tuskegee Institute. She bestowed $38,000, some sources even say $50,000, to the Institute. In addition to this lump sum, Mary Shaw stipulated that other funds from her estate also go to Tuskegee. Some of these sums, she specified, should be used to establish a scholarship fund for female students in memory of her daughter. Any and all of her residual estate, too, should go to Tuskegee. I know sometimes it's helpful to think about these numbers, sums of money adjusted for inflation. So her gift today would have been the equivalent of about $1.5 million, which is a very sizable gift. But I think what's even more compelling is to consider the really relative value, maybe the economic significance of this donation in its historical context. So the year Mary Shaw died, the school's, Tuskegee's, total expenses amounted to around $100,000. In other words, her bequest would fund a third of the school's annual expenses. So Mary Shaw's contribution was no drop in the bucket. It was truly a transformative gift. It is no wonder that when Booker T. Washington, who is pictured here, heard about the gift, he reported that it was, quote, the most encouraging gift that has come to us during the history of the school. It was also, Washington believed, quote, one of the largest single gifts ever made by a colored person to a colored institution, end quote. The Associated Press caught wind of Shaw's will, and her generosity made national news as editors reprinted the story across the states. From South Carolina, Massachusetts, North Dakota, Indiana, Florida. This impressive sum reflected the importance of Tuskegee and its mission to Mary Shaw, as well as her own aspirations for African American women. Yet, this legacy did not come without contestation. So noteworthy was Mary Shaw's gift that a group of relations contested Shaw's last will and testament, claiming that she was not of sound mind when making the generous bequest. Catherine Teneyck's descendants, too, proceeded to bring a case contesting the will. They hoped, through the technicality of language, to prevent Tuskegee from seeing the generous bequeathment. Catherine Teneyck, they claimed, had granted Mary Shaw the power to distribute the estate to any person or persons she desired. Tuskegee, went the plaintiff's argument, was not a person. They also argued that under an 1860 New York law, married women were not allowed to bequeath more than half of their estate to a benevolent, charitable, or literary association. They could not forget their husbands. The plaintiff's argument in both cases ran aground. The judge and the jury, which took only a few minutes to decide the case, were not convinced. Booker T. Washington sat in court the day Mary Shaw's will was upheld. The New York Sun reported that Washington left the courtroom very much pleased at the decision to honor Mary Shaw's wishes, and Washington adhered to her stipulation, and he created the Ethel Shaw Memorial Scholarship Fund. So while the gift to Tuskegee certainly drew the most attention, it was not the only institution that Mary Shaw sought to support through her estate. She invested in smaller ways in her community of Flushing and sought to construct alternative futures for women who, like her daughter, devoted themselves to betterment through education. She left $10,000, a truly considerable sum of money in 1905, to her mother, and another $10,000 to her friend, Annie Johnson, who had traveled with her and the person with whom she was residing when she passed. She left $250 to her goddaughter, Helen Ethelda Smith, and Shaw's philanthropy extended to several other female friends as well, among them Ada Fisher, Kate Smith Dickinson, and Bella Warwick. Bella Warwick was married to William Warwick, one of the first African-American graduates of the University of Pennsylvania. The Warwicks lived, and Dr. Warwick worked out of their home at 31 West Harvey Street in Philadelphia. Bella Warwick's sister-in-law was Midavo Warwick Fuller, who was a famous sculptor who studied under Rodin in Paris. And this is Midavo Warwick Fuller pictured here, which I think just goes to show how Shaw really immersed herself and was truly a supporter of this growing Black middle class, really through her investments in women. Beyond the women in her life, Mary Shaw's philanthropic goals reached into the Flushing community and beyond. She stipulated that $1,000 go to what was then the Flushing Free Library, which might explain why Mary Shaw's portrait, the picture of her, hung for so many years and why we still have a portrait of there today. With the money, the library purchased books for a reference section, which it titled the Shaw Reference Collection, some of which are still housed in the library today. We have some pictures from the archive from the Mary Shaw collection. This was one book, the Book of Decorative Furniture, purchased with the funds and indicated as such through the stamp on the front there. As you can see, this is a book stamp that displays the Shaw Reference Library in the upper right-hand corner. This book was from 1911. And here's a bookplate that establishes a book's inclusion in the Shaw Reference Library from about 1910. The inscription states, "This book belongs to the reference library bought with the Mary Ann Shaw legacy to the Flushing Library Association and is permanently deposited in the Flushing branch of the Queensborough Public Library." She gave another $1,000 to the hospital and dispensary of the town of Flushing, which was nearly 1/10 of the hospital's annual operating cost. The Brooklyn Daily Times reported that, kind of unsurprisingly, there was much rejoicing in Flushing the day that Mary Shaw's will was upheld in the courts. Mary Shaw also bequeathed $2,000 to the St. Philip's Parish Home. Though not in Flushing, the St. Philip's Parish Home served African-American women and men who were, as the benevolent organization described, aged, infirm, and destitute. Founded in 1872, the organization was located here on Boston Road in the Bronx, where by 1900 it was supporting 15 individuals, all through private donation. Mary Shaw's $2,000 donation gave the institution financial legs for an entire year and then some. One Modern History of the Bronx, written in 2017, noted that, quote, "Up until very recent times, people recalled seeing old men resting comfortably on the porch which occupied the entire length of the front of the building. The 1.5-story moss-covered wooden frame structure was torn down in 2017, which is why I have a Google Images screen grab from prior to 2010. And finally, to her husband, who survived her, she left $50. John Shaw, after returning from his years in Europe, struggled with paralysis. Prominent men, including Booker T. Washington, helped support him financially as he aged. He passed away during the heat of July 1909, living in tenement housing near Harvard's campus in Cambridge, and working primarily as an author. So this is the street today, what it looks like where John Shaw passed in 1909. He was just 60 years old. The New York Age, considered one of the most prominent African American newspapers in its time, wrote upon Mary Shaw's passing in 1905, quote, "In some fitting manner, Shaw's deed should be commemorated so that her name and example would be perpetuated." The paper's editors, quote, "feared the generosity of Mrs. Mary A. Shaw of New York toward the race has not received the attention it should." But her Flushing community had not forgotten her. The library formed a Mary Ann Shaw Society that builds on Mary Shaw's legacy of investing in education, books, and community. In 2018, the Queen's Library held a ceremony honoring Shaw, featuring grammar school students and the research conducted by community members and students alike. The library also commissioned and revealed this portrait of Mary Shaw by artist Eddie Abrams. Like the 1880s photograph, the portrait of Mary Ann Shaw now lives in the Flushing Library, where a new generation of readers and community members recognize her familiar face. So, in the spirit of the New York Age, we can try to afford Mary Shaw the attention she deserves and perpetuate her example. Mary Shaw advocated for expanded educational and social opportunities for African American women and men. She was a champion not only for Flushing, but for racial equality on a national scale. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, you know me. You have yours. She didn't get too close to each other, right? Because we get the feedback. Oh. Thank you, guys. Yeah. Let's do first. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you very much, and this was fantastic. I'm Dennis Walcott, and can we give Hope another round of applause, please? Because I thought that was marvelous. So, for those who know me, know I won't follow the script that I have, so I'm just letting you know beforehand. I'm just going to start with one question. How long did it take to do the research?
Well, for the talk, I've been working on it for several months, but what started me down this kind of path into Mary Shaw's life was the photograph, which I came across actually when I was at the New York Historical, and it was labeled in their collections as unidentified woman. So I guess I started researching her 2 years ago, so it's been kind of a slowly
Evolving
building.
type
Yes,
of
yeah.
process. So how I'm not following the script, I'm going to throw it out to the floor right away, because I don't want to monopolize. For those who may have questions, there are, I think, microphones going to be around. So just please raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you if you have a question at all. And I see one right over there.
Good evening. Thank you for presenting this wonderful topic. I was not aware of Mary Shaw, and I've lived in Flushing for almost 40 years. However, I was curious, with Ms. Shaw's interest in Flushing specifically, I was wondering, was there any research that you came about that identified how she was also seeking funds? I'm referring to possibly her outreach to Olivia Slocum Sage, who is a Gilded Age philanthropist in Queens.
That's a fantastic question. I honestly, one of the biggest questions, and let me just preface this by saying, I hope this is a launching point for more research on Mary Shaw and her incredible network and the world she lived in. But one of the questions that really remains for me is why she chose Flushing, why the Shaws moved here specifically, and the networks, yeah, that she was able, how she did this philanthropy work during her time here. I mean, we know she got a lot of money from Catherine Tennig, but that wasn't until 1893. So I'm sorry, I don't have any more information for you. It's one of the many things that keeps you coming back to the research is how was she funding all this work in the school while she was the principal?
And as a historian, why are stories like this so important for the public?
As a historian, I am most interested in kind of everyday people who were living their lives, the people who we don't learn about in our textbooks, but who managed to really shape the course of events and have very extensive reaches just by doing the work kind of on a local level. And I think it's also so interesting to study people like Mary Shaw because I think the sort of realness of her comes through, that she was a real person living in very complicated times, and the work that she was able to do despite that is pretty incredible, and I think is kind of a beacon of hope of how we can make differences sort of on the very local level through doing work in our communities.
And also the connection you made between Flushing, Tuskegee, Washington, D.C., and laying out her pattern of where she lived and how she grew up as far as serving the community as well.
Yeah.
Other questions? Now, Jacqueline, I'm going to put you on the spot. I know you must have a question. I'm looking at you. Yeah. No? There you go, then.
What of her husband's attachment to Macedonia AME Church? Nothing was mentioned there. I'm pretty sure that part of the reason they settled on Flushing was not just the welcoming.
Hold it to.
Not just the welcoming atmosphere, but the fact that the husband also needed a job. And I believe there's an attachment to Macedonia that is not being mentioned.
So I know that a lot of the people that they, like the Lyceum Association, also had connections to the AME Church, and that John Shaw likely had a connection. I didn't come across any records, but in my own research that kind of showed him working there. But I know that there's a lot still to be learned from the community about his connections to the AME Church. And actually, I was talking about this with Susan Latham. Is that's another area that we would like to understand a bit more, because I think it could be that missing link of why the family did come here. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your research and giving us a little bit more history about her. What happened to the peach farm that she was left from the Tennigs and their other businesses and properties that they had?
In New Jersey?
Yes.
Yeah. I have not traced that, but I'm sure it could be the first item on my agenda if you're curious about it. I know she had kind of gotten rid of a lot of the property that she inherited, like the actual real property, by the time she traveled to Europe. I'm sure newspapers and other records can trace kind of the sale of those properties, the peach farm in New Jersey and otherwise, but I'm not quite sure when those were sold or.
Okay, also, and as a point of information, Jacqueline and I are quilters, and we have 2 quilts over at the Kingsland Queens Historical Society with Mary Elizabeth Shaw. That's there now.
That's amazing. We should all go see it if we haven't been yet.
In your research, did
Queens
anything?
Historical Society.
Queens Historical Society.
In your research, did anything surprise you? Did something just jump off the page? You said, "Oh my goodness."
So I'm a historian. I do women's history. I'm a women's historian, and I'm used to kind of finding women at the edges of records and different stories. But what really struck me about Mary Shaw's life is how she was really at the center of all of these documents and the records that come up through the archive, and also just how women in general, not just Mary Shaw, but Catherine Teneyck and all the women that Mary Shaw left her estate to, and the fund at Tuskegee was specifically for women's education. That's, I think, something very rare to see, is the investment in women specifically, and how women were really at the center of this story.
So if I can ask you a personal question, how did you evolve to doing the type of research you do? Because you talked about being on the edge and specifically around women. How did you reach that particular point in your historical referencing?
That's a really great question. I can't remember a time where I honestly wasn't interested in kind of the people that I think get, passed over, or overlooked, or are just kind of assumed to be tangential to the story. For example, because, they don't have the right to vote. Oh, so, they're not important for a story of politics. But, as Mary Shaw shows and so many other women's history can show, that's absolutely not true. There's so much work that these women are doing in politics with democracy that don't involve, even have necessarily having the right to vote. So I was just kind of always interested in what are people doing on the ground. I don't think that answers your question of
It
how I
does,
came to
yeah,
it.
very much
but-
so, very much so. I just wanted to check. Other questions? And then over here.
I do have another question. I was curious, the African American community in Flushing, especially the, I guess, innovators and inventors in Mary Shaw's, circle, would have been very small. But I was curious as to whether or not there's any research that showed her interaction with Lewis Latimer.
Not that I've found, and I believe that he moved to Flushing after she had already left. If I'm not mistaken, he moved in the early 1900s, and I think she had left by 1900 to travel and move back to Pennsylvania. But there are still, I'm sure, many connections to be found that were there.
Hi. I was wondering if any or much of your research came from the Schomburg collection?
Some of the images were from the Schomburg. I wasn't able to find much in their archival manuscripts that had to do with the Flushing community, interestingly. But they have a lot of really fantastic photographs. And I think a lot of their collections also have to do with a little bit later, like Harlem Renaissance era, kind of into the early 20th century a little bit more. But again, yeah, I'm sure with a little bit more digging and a little bit more time, there might be some of these networks and all these amazing connections that would surface.
This was so interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I wanted to know about the community because there seemed to be a very thriving Black community in Flushing. And I know that they have the graveyard where they have many of the Black people that had passed. And I remember when I first came to Flushing that I met an elder lady, and I was asking her where she, came from, and she said, "No, my family has, always lived in Flushing," and that it was a community. And I was always curious about, because I didn't hear anything, or see anything that was written about the Flushing community.
You're asking about the community that was here?
The Flushing Black community that she came to here.
Yeah.
How long it had been here,
At least since 1811, I believe there are probably people in the audience who could answer this much better than I could, and especially in terms of the burial grounds. But
Actually, my name is Robbie Garrison. I'm co-chair of the Conservancy for the Old Town of Flushing Burial Ground, which at one time was a public cemetery that the Quakers bought from the village of or town of Flushing, that there should be a place of respect for those who did not actually belong to the church or something of that sort, have placed for burial. That would be for Native Americans as well. And it is my understanding that there was a thriving Black community in Flushing at the time. And by the way, I'm from Philadelphia, so I'm not really a Flushing person. But because of the burial ground, I have done this research to understand that area of Flushing. And so as a result, that burial ground, along with the thriving Black community of Flushing, became dispossessed. And there are quite some stories available for those that are interested in the dispossession of Black people in Flushing, as well as some would have it, the Black Dublin of Flushing. It's a long story of dispossession, but it was a thriving community. And the powerless are usually the ones who are the easiest to get rid of. And this is how it happened.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Yes.
Quick question. So the free library she made, was that the one that became this library?
It was incorporated as part of the Queens Public Library system. Yes, so it was on this location before Queens was a borough, part of New York City. It was an independent city, but the first library eventually became part of the Queens Public Library broader system.
Wow, that's amazing. And quick follow-up, because I know there's not much, like, did she had any like articles or like speech that we could, find like more words from her? Like, that was
Welcome to the struggle. I haven't come across any, but as I was saying, I'm really like an optimist when it comes to doing this kind of work, and there's such rich knowledge across all different historians and people doing historical research. So I'm hopeful that, maybe someday something in her own words, other than her will, which was, ventriloquized through a lawyer, her own voice will kind of come to us someday in some form of document, letter, speech. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That leads to my last question, which is, I know it's hard to do like research on like, because if she had Instagram, that would be much easier, right? Yeah. But like, how did you like get through the process, like get to know, like gather all these information, like?
I really, I have to just say that the digitization of sources is incredible, particularly newspapers. And I really like that you mentioned, Instagram and social media. Newspapers used to be social media. I mean, they would print, oh, this person came here to visit their aunt, and then they left, and they went to Europe that day, and they're having the school graduation, and the students did these things. And there's tons on the school board meetings, and the teachers, they would print who the teachers are every year coming into the school. So newspapers kind of act as a social media of the past. So they are a very rich resource. But again, I think, it's just scraping the surface of all the things that we could know about her and about other historical figures. So thank you for that question.
So I want to pick up on that point because Jacqueline Colson, who is the person who came to the Central Library to tell us about the misspelling of the name, and there's as Susan indicated in the introduction, very persistent around it. And with Jacqueline's permission, I just want to get a sense from Jacqueline, so you two can connect as well, how you really knew that and came about to bringing that to our attention, and then, as Susan indicated, having that lead into this. So if I may.
So, hi. So a few years ago, before we had the revealing of Eddie's portrait, they elected me to do the research. Yes, I was just sitting there, they elected me. But I was so glad that they did it. So up to the night before we were supposed to have that program, we were still doing research. For me, I found her will. And then I realized, wait, there's conflicting information. And this was from the press. And I decided, okay, we just did the entire name, even the wrong name, because we didn't have the proof. But from then, I kept saying, we need to fix this. And it's what, over, 2 years with you, but it's longer, it's been longer.
It was prior to COVID.
Yes.
It was prior to COVID, right.
So it's been a few years, and I just happened I was picking up actually my Mary Shaw quilt that I put in a show at Central Library, and I missed the artist's talk, which I wanted to shove it in, their face and say, look, this is the information. Yes, I'm not a historian, but you guys need to get this right. Research online. Now you can't get to, I've tried to find that same will online and I wasn't able to. But we also had help from, what's the name? Carl Belanis, and from Maple Grove Cemetery. He's also a historian. So we did have help, but on my end, I found the will online and I started reading the will and I realized, oh my God, they had a kid. We had no information on her. So that's, I'm so happy that you gave us all that information.
Hope, you wanted to follow up on that? That's fine.
And then I'm
I'm
just
sorry,
gonna,
Susan.
and then I'm just going to follow up because when Jacqueline reached out to Dennis, and then Dennis passed Jacqueline on to me, what Jacqueline, you didn't realize is that I am a total history nerd. And so there's lots of stuff that can keep me busy, but this one I just continue to move forward with. And then we discovered Hope's post on the New York Historical, which, and then I found Hope. So yeah, so Jacqueline, it was your persistence again that really led to today. And the timing of of the post from the New York Historical was perfect. So.
Yeah. So I wanted to just, hold on, in the back, all the way in the back.
Good afternoon. My name is Maureen Gray, and I'm currently doing research in Southeast Queens.
Could you put that closer to your mouth?
I'm currently doing research in Southeast Queens. And I do concur that I've done a lot of research in which I'm going away on vacation, the Smith family is going on vacation, all of these little pieces of advertisements have allowed you to set up a little bit of information about places. Recently I had a position here in Flushing and I said, where is this Black Flushing neighborhood that I keep on talking about that communicated with Jamaica? Jamaica had a Black neighborhood called the Green, which I found out recently is derogatory. It was Douglaston. And there actually is a street called Douglas Street. And the research question here is it named for Frederick Douglass? That's the key point here. That's the question. So I'm passing it out to everyone. But finding information is very difficult, and I encourage the group of people who are with me to always mention that save your letters, archive them, put them in the Central Library. A lot of African Americans don't do it. They're culturally made to feel that they're not to do it. Oh, I'm not that important, we'll just throw it out. And then the children throw them out. Letters, so it may be hard to find any of these research letters and documents because the culture does not encourage, with the exception of people who are history buffs, they do not encourage archiving your own private information. All right, how did I get started with this? This is my question. I was researching a particular church in Queens and their history so as to try and landmark it. And I came across Jamaica's church called Grace Episcopal Church, in which they had the names of slaves and, also the Presbyterian Church, which is the oldest Presbyterian church in the nation. I'm wondering if you did any research on the St. Philip's Protestant Episcopal Church, same denomination, in regards to, was she on any types of organizations? Were there any slave names associated? Because there's an absence of contact with African communities, because right below that church, 2 blocks over, was the African community. And you would not know that. Just like you don't know that this is the Freedom Trail. There's a Freedom Trail plaque right outside the library, but they're plastered over. So I was just wondering, have you done any research on the Protestant Episcopal Church in Philadelphia regarding her association or any African American activity? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. That's a really interesting question. And I have to say that her Philadelphia connection is very kind of nebulous still in terms of what I've been able to do. I haven't been able to go to Philadelphia yet and get into any physical archives. And I'll just say that archivists, I mean, we don't even know what we don't know until we ask an archivist. They're amazing. They have encyclopedic knowledge of what's in archives. So maybe reaching out to an archivist in Philadelphia or the community there. But I'm sorry, I don't have a better answer for you onto what exactly her connection was. I'm very also interested in her father and what her father did, why they were in Pennsylvania and Lancaster in particular. So thank you. Yes, I'll just answer your question with more questions. So I'm sorry. Yeah.
So I have just one other thing, which is that there's a treasure trove of history here. If you are not familiar with Queen's Memory, that is a project that Queens Public Library and Queens Community College have worked on together. We have a representative and one of the founders here today, but Queen's Memory is really interested in collecting information, letters, family history, photos from people like you, so that it is available for future generations, so that in the future, historians like Hope will have access to that kind of information that may otherwise be lost. So I encourage you to go to Queens Public Library's website, look up Queen's Memory. There's a lot of great stuff there. And then we have events where we bring scanners so that you can scan a bunch of that information. So keep your eye out for that future event.
So Hope, I want to thank you for an informative, detailed, historically referenced presentation on Mary Shaw. And I'm taking a lot out of this. And also, I'm fully charged as far as what more we can do together, collectively, as far as raising the profile of Mary Shaw. So once again, can we give Hope a big round of applause?